Just quick show of hands, how many of you were in some of the no-code playbook sessions yesterday? So, okay, majority. Okay, good. One of the, the principles we embrace is continuous feedback and adaptation. So I think, because these are shorter sessions, we're going to mix things up a little bit. So we're going to breeze through. We're not going to present to most of the slides. You have the slides digitally so you can use them, but I think we want to make this a little bit more interactive and try to ground it in some, hopeful questions about this. So this first session is all around go live. So we set the stage yesterday with sort of the overview, and we focused a lot on design. So now we're going to speed things up to double time and go into the go live session. So you've seen sort of the principles. Let's jump through this just in the interest of time. Okay, so go live is comprised of a series of stages. I think they'll show up here. So prototype to MVP, feedback loop, governance checks, and first release. And so we're going to briefly, time permitting, hit on each of these and hopefully get some Q&A along the way. Okay, so, we touched on this, but just to sort of reinforce, the idea is to really use the tools and the benefits of no code wherever possible. And so unlike sort of traditional, handoffs between design and build phase, this is much more fluid, much more iterative. Also keep in mind, during the prototyping, the design and prototype stage, which was in the design phase, we actually already have a start to the application that further accelerates the beginning of building, because we're starting with essentially a working early version of the app. We are adding now features incrementally on top, and that also speeds things up, right? Because instead of having to wait until the full app is done, we can start adding features and get sort of micro feedback along the way, and that'll be something that gets you a better output as a result, because you're able to make course corrections, not just on sort of a release basis or every time you're able to recruit users, but having users embedded inside the team, having, twice a week stand-ups with your stakeholder to get feedback. These will be things that you can use during and throughout this rapid sort of iteration on individual features and use cases to improve and make tweaks and improve the application development. So these are sort of the four sort of primary activities of this stage. We've talked a lot, and I think this audience is probably uniquely familiar with sort of no-code development cycles. I did want to briefly touch on sort of Kanban and why we think that's such a great sort of structure or framework for this type of development. Software development, we've also talked a little bit, a fair amount yesterday about sort of, when to use and the options analysis for how to think about custom software development. It still is very important depending on the needs of your application. And then I'll spend a little bit of time briefly on Q&A, but I'd love to get more feedback from the team as well. So let's dive in. So I think the next slide is around sort of the no-code development cycles, right? And this maps one-to-one, as we discussed during the design phase, into the tools themselves, right? That is the point, which is these aren't separate or somehow you have to interpret or translate. You're using the tools directly, both on the design and on the building, which accelerates the development. The big difference here is before, when you were in the design phase, you were, stubbing out parts of the application just because of where you were in the process, right? So you may not have done all of the error conditions in the workflow. You may have taken sort of, the happy path through. You may not have built out all the backend integrations. You may have stubbed them. So in a lot of ways, it's taking the frame of the app that you've prototyped and now starting to go deep. You're applying the lens of what's in the MVP, and you're also then filling in more richness and depth around the pieces then that are going to be delivered as part of MVP. But it's iterative. It's an evolution, not a start from scratch. And so you can at any time demo the full application still, but some of these will get richer and richer and richer every time you show your stakeholder.
And I would say that important part here is that you should define your MVP really accurately, because this is not the stage where you want to take a prototype and put all details there. So you need to really focus on what you've defined as your MVP part of your application, and that may be pretty challenging because often from end users we get feedback that they want everything from the single first release. And definitely, based on tool set that you select, you get different set of capabilities, set of tools to provide these functionality for your users. But basically, whatever no-code platform you choose, you get ability to really show them what you are going to provide as soon as you get this or that feature. And Kanban methodology significantly helps to build that kind of process.
Right. Show of hands quickly. How many of you use Kanban? Any users of Kanban? How many use Scrum? Yeah, I tend to get more people familiar with Scrum just because I think it's especially in a lot of development shops it has been more established. But Kanban, we think for no code is a better fit, right? It can be applied and adopted more incrementally. It provides a lightweight sort of framework or structure or method that allows you to manage the flow of work, but without having to fully adopt all the ceremonies of Scrum.
And how do you think? Why is that so? What is the reason why Kanban fits better? Yeah, absolutely. And that is a really cool thing about the no-code approach, because here you get a really small distance between people who create the application and people who use that. And often these are even the same people if we are talking about no-code developers from your business units. And that makes it possible to get your result to your end users as soon as you get that. Because in traditional development, you have a business analyst who puts the task to the developer, then developer reports to business analysts or to PM, and then they go to demo that to end users. And here, the situation is quite different. And you should use that advantage by getting feedback as fast as possible.
Let me go to the next slide. I think, we talked about the role of traditional development. It still plays a role. We sort of talked about that at fair length during the design session yesterday. The additional thing I'll call out is, it also can fit into the Kanban method we were just describing, right? Especially if the custom software development is relatively also small and sort of, incremental pieces that also can be done in a way that doesn't have to rely on, predefined releases or sprints for sort of smaller bite-sized developments. Obviously, the larger your sort of software development is, it may then have to lean on or use more traditional sort of software development methodologies for custom development. So this is where, using sort of the scale as defined by the application matrix to sort of judge, can you use Kanban for everything, or do you need to sort of use some hybrid of Kanban for sort of the no code and then perhaps traditional software releases for your custom software? All right. So show of hands, and I probably gave the answer away yesterday a little bit, but how many of you today, do sort of all of these layers on your no code projects? And I, the point that I was sort of making when we talked about this briefly in the design phase is, some of these I think absolutely still apply, but I think you may need to sort of think differently about them, right, and sort of adapt some of your testing strategy appropriately, right? Otherwise, you may find that you're over testing. If you go back sort of one slide briefly, along the bottom, infrastructure environmental testing is super important when you are implementing the no-code platform, right? And there you will go through and test it, but beyond that, then individual applications, right, typically then are abstracted away from having to do the same level of perf testing or environmental testing. The same also is true on unit testing. Once you've established the no-code platform and you've established sort of your library of pre-built widgets, right, those don't need to be unit tested in the classic sense that you would, where you have to test all units of code that have been custom built from scratch, right? You still have to test business rules and validations. And so what you see in orange, I think, really becomes more important on a relative basis as you think about no code. The first time you build to an API, you should still API test. And then integration testing, user acceptance testing are still super important because they test sort of the end-to-end user experience and flows, right? But just in proportion of where you put your time, you can free up more energy for the top of the pyramid because of the platform really abstracting away a lot of the complexity out of the bottom too.
And I would add that key role of Center of Excellence in this process is to explain to all members of the process of creating applications the importance of testing, because a common mistake is that if I create something with no-code tools, then I don't need testing at all, and you should definitely avoid that.
All right, feedback loop. We'll go through this fairly quickly because I know we're under time crunch. The feedback loop happens in parallel with the building, right? And so as you're releasing, sometimes daily small features or use cases, getting feedback continuously is important. This prevents you from sort of the massive user acceptance or final user testing because you've gotten their feedback along the way. You've ensured alignment throughout the process. And it really allows you to focus on sort of fast responses to their feedback as well, because you're getting it in small chunks. You can then address it, tweak it, and move on so that the next time they see it, you may have already addressed or incorporated their feedback. We did a quiz yesterday about the right number of user stakeholders, so I won't ask it again, but ideally one, right? And the idea is sort of counterintuitive. Sometimes you want to, or you think you want, more feedback is better, so more stakeholders is better. The reality is, though, it gets really hard to ensure that you're able to prioritize and focus, and so having a single primary stakeholder is important, and they should be the one who then prioritizes, especially around MVP, what's essential to that, or changes to the process. You've also got user feedback built in, hopefully, because the developers themselves are inside the business. So you're getting a lot of feedback. You don't need to have multiple stakeholders. Frequency, just more is better here in this case. Having multiple stand-ups throughout the week, getting it continuously. Kanban helps here because you can have pure, open transparency about what things are done and ready for feedback.
And in no-code process, again, you are really close to your end users, and you should utilize that advantage on 100%.
Why don't we skip this in the interest of time? So governance. Governance is a super important topic. And I think about it in terms of sort of there's a 2x2 matrix of the types of governance you need to consider. There's the external types of governance that is imposed by regulation or laws, other sort of industry-specific requirements, and then there's internal governance, right, that may be imposed and enforced through your own audit committees or internal standards, and then there's sort of this continuum of some are very information and data centric. You have to enforce access rights or data ownership. Then there's some that are more process centric, right? And so, go to the next slide. Governance sort of spans, typically both the internal and the external side. Everyone's sort of familiar, and we did sort of, a contest yesterday around things like HIPAA and, PCI and SOC 2. So there's a bunch that people are familiar with because they're enforced by some external regulatory sort of standard, but also just as important is for a lot of companies, they have internal guidance and compliance that they need to meet, right? And so if you're large enough to have a COE, the COE can help you sort of navigate through this process and identify which internal or external standards. In other cases, it may need to be a project manager or program manager. Data governance is an important key topic, right? The thing I would say, actually, it's sort of one of those blessings and a curse, depending how you look at it. A lot of organizations have recently had to go through GDPR, right? Especially if they're European-based or they have European customers. GDPR, for a lot of companies, was a big investment they had to make. The good news is that it has probably allowed them to formalize more of their process and org around data ownership and privacy, right? So they may have established the governance structure, the ownership, which makes it easier then as you're building sort of your no-code platform and applications to work inside that structure. So that's one of the tips I would add. And then last but not least, there's a lot of compliance that people don't even think about, which is compliance with other teams that are, using similar processes or components. And so there's this notion of, conflict resolution inside the organization. The COE can play a big role here in terms of mediating differences, conflicts around how a process should be modeled, or a component that is shared across multiple teams might need to be changed. So there's a conflict and change management function here that the COE can play a big role.
And basically, that is the second part of this, medal, because when using a single no-code stack, you have really easy access to common processes, common data, but on the other hand, you have to manage those risks of affecting some other divisions and some other applications.
So this is the final stage. You've built the MVP, you've gotten feedback to ensure that it's aligned with your business stakeholders, you've passed and used governance checks to ensure that you're ready. This final step is about actually deploying it to your end users, right? And so the final step, though, of course, is to circle back with your business stakeholder, make sure that they do sign off and approve. This, in most no-code environments, then can move pretty quickly in terms of the steps, right? There's a higher degree of automation and sort of continuous deployment that are part of most no-code tool sets that allow you, to sort of push it through, but that doesn't mean that you can cut corners. There's still checkpoints in each of these, when you pass each test and when you go through the final acceptance with your stakeholder to make sure that they have signed off and that they are ready.
And again, application metrics would help you to define what is the best way to go through all those steps based on what kind of application you are building.
I made this point earlier, but the more feedback that you've gotten throughout the earlier stage, right, then the sort of less pressure is on sort of, the user acceptance. And so, think about, and this, sometimes gets blurry, but push more of the feedback that you're collecting into the user feedback that you're getting through the earlier stages, right? That will test out, the functionality, the usability, so that really the final checks at user acceptance are just about sort of enabling the business outcomes that they're trying to achieve. Enablement, always usually the thing that gets overlooked in the, when the software is done, you want to push it live, but ensuring that you've started enablement sooner. And in fact, one of the benefits of no code is the fact that you can start your training teams, your documentation teams, building content with even the prototype or with earlier stages than you might in traditional sort of custom software. The documentation team or the training teams are always sort of in the last sort of high intensity part of the project because they're waiting for the software, right? And they're having to then build in crunch time, where done properly, you can start building enabling content much earlier in the process. All right.
Okay.
18, thank you.